The stagecoach rattled toward Devil's Pass with 5 souls aboard, unaware that death itself waited in the rocks above, and that salvation would come from a ghost everyone thought had died 3 years ago in those very mountains. Grace Hammond pressed her gloved hand against the window frame as the coach climbed the winding trail through the Utah Territory in the summer of 1878. Dust spiraled behind the wheels, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that seemed to seep through every crack in the wooden frame. She had left St. Louis 2 weeks ago, making her way west to Parowan, where she would begin her new position as a schoolteacher. At 22 years old, she had finally saved enough money to start fresh after her father's debts had consumed everything they owned. He had died the previous winter, leaving her with nothing but a single trunk of belongings and the determination to build something better. The other passengers seemed lost in their own thoughts. Beside her sat Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, a plump woman in her 50s who had not stopped talking about her daughter's wedding in Salt Lake City for the past 3 hours. Across from them, a portly merchant named Herman Wells dozed with his chin against his chest, his breath whistling through his mustache. Next to him, a young man who had introduced himself as Thomas Clark kept fidgeting with his hat, his eyes constantly darting to the windows. Grace found his nervous energy unsettling, though she told herself that perhaps he was simply unused to travel. The 5th passenger was the driver's guard, a weathered man named Pike who sat up top with the reins, his rifle always within reach. Grace had heard him talking with the driver at the last station, mentioning something about increased outlaw activity in these parts. The Cassidy gang had hit a mining payroll 3 weeks back, and tensions were running high throughout the territory. The coach lurched over a particularly rough section of trail, and Mrs. Pritchard clutched Grace's arm with a small shriek. Grace offered her a reassuring smile, though her own stomach had begun to twist with unease. The walls of the pass were closing in around them, towering cliffs of red rock that blocked out the afternoon sun and cast everything in shadow. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, but Grace could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. High above in those rocks, Nathan York crouched behind a boulder with his rifle across his knees, watching the stagecoach make its slow approach. 3 years in these mountains had sharpened his senses until he could hear a snake move through brush at 50 yards, could smell weather changing a day before it arrived, could read tracks like other men read newspapers. His dark hair hung past his shoulders now, held back with a strip of leather, and his beard covered the lower half of his face. His arms bore the scars of surviving in country that killed softer men, and his shoulders had grown even broader from hauling wood and stone, from tracking game across impossible terrain, from simply enduring. He had not spoken to another human being in 6 months, had not wanted to. The mountains had become his sanctuary after everything had been taken from him, after the Cassidy gang had murdered his brother and left Nathan for dead in a ravine. They had thought the wolves would finish what their bullets started, but Nathan had crawled out of that darkness with something harder than bone keeping him alive. Revenge was a patient thing, and Nathan had learned patience from the mountains themselves. Movement below caught his attention. He raised his rifle scope to his eye and scanned the trail ahead of the coach. His jaw tightened as he spotted them, 5 men positioned in the rocks at the narrowest part of the pass, exactly where Nathan had tracked them that morning. The Cassidy gang, or what remained of it after the law and rival outlaws had whittled down their numbers. But Jack Cassidy himself was down there. Nathan could see his distinctive red bandana even from this distance, and that was all that mattered. Nathan had been tracking them for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment. He had expected them to hit the stage, had known they would choose this pass. What he had not expected was the feeling that shot through him when he caught sight of the dark-haired young woman in the coach window, her face turned toward the cliffs with an expression of wonder mixed with apprehension. Something in that look struck him like a physical blow, reminding him of feelings he thought the mountains had frozen out of him. He shook his head sharply. The woman was nothing to him. The passengers were nothing to him. Only Cassidy mattered, only the debt written in his brother's blood. But even as he thought it, Nathan found himself adjusting his position, angling for a better view of the killing ground below, calculating trajectories and timing with a precision that had nothing to do with his original plan. The coach rounded the final bend, and Nathan saw Cassidy step out into the trail with his rifle raised. The other 4 outlaws emerged from the rocks like cockroaches, surrounding the stage before Pike even had time to reach for his weapon. "Hold there," Cassidy's voice carried up to where Nathan crouched. "Nobody needs to die today if you all cooperate." Nathan's finger tightened on the trigger. One shot, that was all it would take from this distance. Put Cassidy down and disappear back into the mountains before anyone even knew he was there. Clean. Simple. Final. Then Cassidy walked to the coach door and yanked it open. Everybody out, nice and slow. Nathan watched through his scope as the passengers climbed down, the merchant first, his hands shaking. Then the young man, who stumbled in his haste. Mrs. Pritchard needed help from one of the outlaws, who grabbed her arm roughly. And then the dark-haired woman, Grace, though Nathan did not know her name yet. She stepped down with her chin raised, her green eyes blazing with barely contained fury rather than fear. "Your valuables," Cassidy demanded, holding out a canvas bag. "Watches, jewelry, money, everything." The merchant was already fumbling with his pocket watch, practically throwing it into the bag. Mrs. Pritchard wept as she removed her rings. Thomas Clark handed over a billfold with trembling hands, but Grace stood perfectly still, her arms at her sides. "I have nothing of value," she said, her voice clear and steady. Cassidy stepped closer to her, and something dark crossed his face. "Pretty thing like you? I doubt that." Nathan was moving before he made the conscious decision, his body acting on instinct honed by 3 years of survival. He could not make the shot on Cassidy now, not with Grace so close. One twitch, and he could hit her instead. But he could not stay hidden either, not with that look in Cassidy's eyes. He began making his way down the cliff face, moving from rock to rock with the silence of a mountain lion. His rifle stayed strapped across his back, his hunting knife loose in its sheath. 5 against 1 were terrible odds, but Nathan had stopped caring about odds around the same time he stopped caring about living or dying. The only thing that mattered was taking Cassidy with him when he went. Down in the pass, Grace held Cassidy's stare without flinching. "I am a schoolteacher traveling to Parowan. I have $40 in my bag, which is everything I own in this world. You are welcome to take it if that will satisfy you, and let us continue on our way." "A schoolteacher," Cassidy said, and something ugly entered his voice. "Well, maybe we can discuss alternative forms of payment." One of the other outlaws laughed, a sound that made Grace's skin crawl, but she refused to show fear. She had learned young that predators fed on fear, that the moment you showed weakness was the moment they struck. Her father had been weak, had let the gambling houses and the whiskey break him down until there was nothing left. Grace had sworn she would never be weak like that. "There will be no discussion," she said flatly. "Take the money and go." Cassidy reached out to grab her arm, and Grace jerked back. His face darkened. "You got spirit, girl, but spirit only gets you so far out here." The first outlaw died without making a sound, Nathan's knife opening his throat from behind before he could even register the attack. Nathan caught the body and lowered it silently to the ground, already moving toward the second man who stood by the horses. This one had time to turn, to see death coming for him in the form of a bearded ghost with eyes like winter ice. Nathan's fist caught him in the throat, crushing his windpipe, and as he fell gasping, Nathan took his pistol. The gunshot that followed was inevitable. Nathan put a bullet through the third outlaw's chest just as the man was turning toward the commotion. The sound echoed through the pass like thunder, and suddenly everyone was moving. Cassidy spun toward the source of the shot, his own pistol coming up. Grace did not think, did not hesitate. She threw herself at him, her shoulder catching him in the ribs and spoiling his aim. His shot went wide, the bullet sparking off rock. He backhanded her across the face, sending her sprawling in the dirt, but those precious seconds gave Nathan the time he needed. He came around the coach like an avalanche, massive and unstoppable. The fourth outlaw managed to get a shot off, but Nathan was already diving, rolling, coming up with both pistols firing. The outlaw went down with bullets in his chest and stomach, dead before he hit the ground. That left only Cassidy, who had his gun pressed against Grace's head where she lay in the dirt. She could taste blood in her mouth, could feel the cold metal against her temple, but she kept her eyes open and focused on the man who had appeared like something out of a fever dream. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to block out the sun. His clothes were a patchwork of buckskin and hide, primitive and weathered. His face was mostly hidden by his beard, but his eyes were visible, and they burned with an intensity that made Grace's breath catch. This was not a man who had simply come down from the mountains. This was something the mountains had made, something raw and dangerous and utterly compelling. "Nathan York," Cassidy breathed, and Grace heard genuine fear in his voice. "They said you were dead." "They were wrong," Nathan said, his voice rough from disuse, like gravel grinding together. "Let her go, Jack." "Why?" Cassidy pressed the gun harder against Grace's head, making her wince. "So you can kill me? At least this way I have leverage." Nathan stood perfectly still, both pistols trained on Cassidy. Grace could see him calculating, measuring angles and distances. "You know that's not going to work. You know how this ends." "Maybe," Cassidy said, "but I can take her with me." Grace spoke then, her voice surprisingly calm despite the gun at her head. "You are going to die today, no matter what you choose. The only question is whether you add my death to whatever sins already stain your soul. Is that how you want to be remembered? As the man who murdered a schoolteacher?" Cassidy's hand was shaking. Grace could feel it through the pressure of the gun. His breathing had become ragged, desperate. Nathan had not moved, had barely even blinked, but Grace could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a fire. "Your brother died begging," Cassidy said suddenly. His eyes locked on Nathan. "Cried like a baby. You should have heard him." Nathan's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, something that made Grace's blood run cold. "I know," he said softly. "I was there. I heard everything. I crawled out of that ravine with his blood on my hands and your bullets in my back. I spent 3 years healing, 3 years tracking you, 3 years thinking about this moment. And you know what I realized?" He took a single step forward, then another. Cassidy's gun was shaking harder now, wavering between Nathan and Grace. "I realized that killing you quick would be a mercy," Nathan continued, his voice deadly quiet. "I realized that what you really deserve is to die knowing that everything you built is gone. Your gang is dead. Your reputation is finished. Nobody is going to remember your name except as a footnote. You are nothing, Jack. You have always been nothing. And killing this woman, hurting her, that would not change any of that. It would just prove that you died as meaningless as you lived." Grace saw the moment Cassidy broke, saw the fear and rage and desperation all crash together in his eyes. His gun swung toward Nathan, pulling away from her head, and she threw herself sideways into the dirt. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. Cassidy's bullet scored a line across Nathan's shoulder, tearing through leather and flesh. Nathan's bullet took Cassidy in the heart, punching through his chest and dropping him like a stone. He was dead before he hit the ground, his red bandana spreading even redder as blood pooled beneath him. Silence fell over the pass, broken only by the nervous stamping of the stagecoach horses and Mrs. Pritchard's quiet sobbing. Grace pushed herself up on trembling arms, staring at Cassidy's body. She had never seen a man die before, had never been that close to death herself. The reality of it crashed over her in waves, making her stomach heave. Nathan stood frozen for a long moment, staring down at the man who had murdered his brother. 3 years of rage and pain and single-minded purpose, all ending in a handful of seconds. He should have felt something, satisfaction or relief or closure. Instead, he felt hollow, empty, like the revenge he had lived for had burned out everything inside him. Then, Grace made a small sound, and Nathan's attention snapped to her. She was trying to stand, her legs shaking beneath her. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth where Cassidy had struck her, and dust covered her traveling dress. But her eyes, when they met his, were clear and steady, full of something Nathan could not name. He moved to her side without thinking, his large hand gentle as he helped her to her feet. Up close, she was even more beautiful than he had realized, with dark hair falling loose from its pins and eyes the color of spring leaves. She was real and warm and alive, and something long frozen in Nathan's chest began to crack. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. Grace shook her head, though her hand came up to touch her split lip. No, I'm fine. You saved my life. All our lives." Nathan released her arm and stepped back, suddenly aware of how wild he must look, how much he probably frightened her. You should go. Get back in the coach and go. But Grace did not move. She was studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as if she could see past the beard and the scars and the 3 years of isolation to whatever remained of the man he used to be. You are bleeding, she said, gesturing to his shoulder. Nathan glanced down at the wound. The bullet had only grazed him, nothing compared to injuries he had survived in the mountains. It is nothing. It is not nothing, Grace said firmly. She turned to the other passengers who were staring at Nathan like he was some kind of wilderness spirit. Mr. Wells, does your mercantile goods include any medical supplies? The merchant nodded mutely, still in shock. Then please retrieve them. Mrs. Pritchard, I need clean water from one of the canteens. Grace looked up at where Pike sat frozen on the driver's seat. Sir, are you injured? Pike shook his head slowly. No, madam, just trying to figure out what in blazes just happened. What happened, Grace said with a calm authority that surprised everyone, including herself, is that this man saved our lives. The least we can do is see to his injury before we continue on our way. Nathan wanted to refuse, to disappear back into the mountains where things made sense and feelings did not exist. But Grace had already moved to the coach, pulling down her trunk and opening it to retrieve clean cloths. Her hands were shaking, he noticed, though her face remained composed. She was in shock, probably, running on instinct and training. But she was also brave, braver than she knew. Against his better judgment, Nathan allowed himself to be led to a flat rock where Grace instructed him to sit. She worked in silence, cleaning the wound with gentle efficiency. Her touch was careful, almost tender, and Nathan found himself watching her face as she concentrated on her task. There was something peaceful about her presence, something that quieted the constant noise in his head. What is your name? She asked as she wrapped a bandage around his shoulder, her fingers brushing against his bare skin. Nathan, he said, Nathan York. I'm Grace Hammond. She secured the bandage and met his eyes. Thank you, Nathan York, for my life. The way she said his name, clear and complete, made something warm unfurl in his chest. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to him with kindness, since anyone had looked at him like he was a person rather than a monster or a ghost. You are welcome, Grace Hammond, he replied, and was surprised to find he meant it. Thomas Clark approached then, his face pale. We should get moving. There might be more outlaws in these parts. Nathan shook his head. Cassidy was the last. The gang is finished. How can you be sure? Wells asked nervously. Because I've been tracking them for 2 weeks, because I know every man who rode with them and where each one fell. Nathan stood, towering over the other men. You are safe now. The pass is clear all the way to Parawan. Grace was packing away the medical supplies, but she paused at his words. You're heading to Parawan? Nathan had not been heading anywhere except back into the mountains, back to the solitude that had become his entire world. But he heard himself say, yes. Then perhaps you would consider traveling with us, Grace said. I know I would feel safer with you along. Mrs. Pritchard, who had been silent since the attack, suddenly spoke up. Oh yes, please. After what just happened, I would not feel right continuing without protection. Pike climbed down from the driver's seat, eyeing Nathan warily. You know how to use those guns? I know, Nathan said simply. Pike nodded slowly. Then you are welcome to ride along. We would be grateful for the company. Nathan should have refused, should have taken his revenge and returned to the mountains where he belonged, but Grace was looking at him with those green eyes, and he found he could not form the words to say no. I will ride up top, he said finally. Keep watch. The bodies were moved off the trail, the horses calmed, and the coach prepared to move on. Nathan retrieved his rifle from where he had left it, along with the pack he had carried down from his camp. Everything he owned fit in that single pack, a stark reminder of how far he had fallen from the rancher he used to be. As he climbed up beside Pike, Nathan caught Grace watching him from the coach window. She offered him a small smile, and he found himself nodding in return. The coach lurched into motion, wheels creaking as they continued through the pass and out into the open country beyond. The remainder of the journey to Parawan took another 4 hours, the landscape gradually changing from towering cliffs to rolling hills dotted with sage and juniper. Nathan sat rigid beside Pike, his eyes constantly scanning for threats, though his mind kept wandering to the woman in the coach below. He told himself it was just the shock of being around people again, the strangeness of human contact after so long alone. But he knew it was more than that. Pike finally broke the silence between them. "That was some shooting back there." Nathan said nothing. "I heard stories about Nathan York," Pike continued. "Rancher up near the mountain pass until Cassidy's gang hit him 3 years back. Killed his brother, burned his place to the ground, left Nathan himself for dead." He glanced at Nathan. "That you?" "Yes," Nathan said. Pike nodded slowly. "Thought you might be. You got that look about you, like a man who has been to hell and back." "Something like that." "What are you planning to do now?" Pike asked. "Now that Cassidy is dead and your business is finished?" Nathan had not thought that far ahead. For 3 years, every moment had been focused on survival and revenge. Now both were accomplished, and he found himself adrift, purposeless. "I do not know," he admitted. "Parowan is a good town," Pike said. "Growing fast. Always need men who know the country, who can handle themselves. Sheriff might have work for you if you are interested." Nathan doubted any town would want a man like him, but he did not argue. He was saved from having to respond when Parowan itself came into view, a collection of buildings clustered along a creek with mountains rising in the distance. It was bigger than Nathan had expected, with a main street, a church steeple, and several dozen homes spreading out from the center. Civilization, such as it was in this part of Utah territory. The coach pulled up in front of the station, and Nathan helped Pike with the horses while the passengers climbed down. Grace was the last to emerge, and Nathan found his eyes drawn to her as she stood in the late afternoon sun, looking around at her new home. She caught him watching and walked over, her expression serious. "Will you be staying in Parowan, Mr. York?" The formal address stung a little after she had used his given name earlier, but Nathan supposed that was proper. They were strangers, really, thrown together by violence and chance. "I have not decided," he said. I hope you will," Grace said quietly. "I would like the opportunity to thank you properly for what you did today. Perhaps over dinner, once I have settled into my lodgings." Nathan opened his mouth to refuse, to make some excuse about leaving town or having other business, but the words would not come. Instead, he found himself saying, "That would be acceptable." Grace's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Good. I'm staying at Mrs. Cooper's boarding house on 3rd Street. Tomorrow evening, if that suits you." "Tomorrow evening," Nathan agreed, wondering what madness had possessed him. Grace collected her trunk with help from Thomas Clark, who was also staying at Mrs. Cooper's, it turned out. Nathan watched them walk down the street together and felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Jealousy, he realized with surprise. He was jealous of the young man walking beside Grace, carrying her trunk, making her laugh with some comment Nathan could not hear. "You got it bad already," Pike observed, coming to stand beside him. Nathan scowled. "I do not know what you mean." "Sure you do not," Pike said with a grin. "Listen, there is a hotel on Main Street that is clean enough. Tell Martha at the front desk that Pike sent you. She will give you a fair rate." Nathan nodded his thanks and shouldered his pack. He had money, coin he had taken from trappers who tried to rob him over the years, enough for a room and supplies. The hotel Pike mentioned was easy to find, and Martha turned out to be a gray-haired woman who barely blinked at Nathan's wild appearance. "Pike says you are all right. That is good enough for me," she said, handing him a key. "Room 4, top of the stairs. There's a bathhouse next door if you are interested." Nathan took the key and climbed the stairs, feeling like he was walking through a dream. The room was small but clean, with a bed, a table, and a window overlooking the street. He set his pack down and stood there for a long moment, trying to remember how to exist in civilization. The face that looked back at him from the small mirror on the wall was almost unrecognizable. The beard covered most of his features, and his hair hung wild and tangled. His clothes were little better than rags. If he was going to have dinner with Grace tomorrow, he could not look like this. The bathhouse was a revelation. Nathan had bathed in mountain streams and lakes, but hot water in a proper tub was a luxury he had forgotten existed. He soaked until the water turned cold, then soaked again in a fresh tub, scrubbing away 3 years of mountain living. His shoulder wound throbbed, but it was already beginning to heal. The hardest part was shaving off the beard. His hand shook as he held the razor, not from fear, but from the strangeness of it all. The face that emerged was leaner than he remembered, marked by scars and weathered by exposure, but recognizably human. He trimmed his hair as best he could, though it still hung past his shoulders. Clean clothes were next. The general store was still open, and Nathan bought sturdy trousers, a shirt, and a vest. The store owner, a thin man named Peterson, eyed Nathan with obvious curiosity but was too polite or too nervous to ask questions. Nathan also purchased soap, a razor, and ammunition for his weapons. He might be trying to rejoin civilization, but he was not foolish enough to go unarmed. Back in his hotel room, Nathan lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling. Sleep should have come easily after so many months of sleeping light in the wilderness, but his mind would not quiet. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Grace's face, saw the moment Cassidy had pressed the gun to her head, saw how close he had come to failing to save her. That night, Nathan dreamed of his brother for the first time in months. They were boys again, running through fields on their family's farm in Missouri before the war, before the West, before everything went wrong. His brother was laughing, calling for Nathan to catch up, and Nathan was running as fast as he could, but never quite reaching him. Then the dream shifted, and his brother was lying in the ravine with blood spreading across his chest, and Nathan was holding him, feeling his life slip away while Cassidy's gang laughed from above. Nathan woke with a gasp, his heart pounding. The room was dark, dawn still hours away. He rose and went to the window, looking out at the sleeping town. Somewhere out there, Grace was sleeping too, safe in her boarding house. The thought calmed him, gave him something to focus on besides the nightmares. Morning came slowly. Nathan forced himself to wait until a reasonable hour before venturing out, though he was awake long before the sun rose. The town was coming to life as he walked the streets, merchants opening their shops, women heading to the market, children running to school. Normal life, the kind Nathan had not experienced in years. He found himself drawn to the schoolhouse, a whitewashed building on the edge of town with a small yard. Through the window, he could see Grace at the front of the room, already at work arranging desks and writing on the chalkboard. She was wearing a simple blue dress, her dark hair pinned up properly, and she looked so lovely that Nathan's breath caught. As if sensing his presence, Grace turned and saw him through the window. Her face lit up with a smile, and she came to the door, opening it to call out to him, "Mr. York, you're up early." Nathan approached slowly, suddenly feeling awkward. "I could say the same about you, Miss Hammond." "Oh, I have so much to prepare before students arrive next week," Grace said. She studied his face, and he saw surprise and something else flicker in her eyes. "You shaved?" "Yes," Nathan said, resisting the urge to touch his bare jaw. "I thought it was time." "You look different," Grace said, "younger, though no less." She trailed off, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "No less what?" Nathan asked, genuinely curious. "Imposing," Grace finished. "You are still quite tall, Mr. York." Nathan found himself almost smiling. "I cannot do much about that." Grace laughed, a sound that seemed to brighten the entire morning. "I suppose not. Would you like to see the school? I'm rather proud of it, even though I've only been here one day." Nathan followed her inside, ducking his head to clear the doorframe. The schoolroom was simple but well-maintained, with rows of desks, a large chalkboard, and shelves waiting to be filled with books. Grace moved through the space with obvious enthusiasm, pointing out various features and explaining her plans for the curriculum. "I want to teach more than just reading and arithmetic," she said. "History, geography, science. I want to give these children every opportunity to better themselves." "You care about it," Nathan observed. "Teaching." "I do," Grace said seriously. "Education is the key to everything, Mr. York. It can lift people out of poverty, out of ignorance. It can change lives." She paused, then added, "My father never valued education. He thought it was a waste for a woman. But my mother, before she died, she made sure I learned. She believed that knowledge was power, especially for women who have so little power in this world." Nathan heard the passion in her voice, the conviction, and felt something shift inside him. Grace was not just beautiful, she was intelligent and driven, someone who wanted to make a difference. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman," he said. "She was," Grace said softly. "I miss her every day. She died when I was 12, and after that it was just my father and me. He tried in his way, but he could not escape his demons, the gambling, the drinking. By the time he died last winter, there was nothing left except debts. "I'm sorry," Nathan said, and meant it. Grace shook her head. "Do not be. I am building something better now, a new life on my own terms." She looked up at him. "What about you, Mr. York? What will you build now that your vengeance is complete?" The question cut right to the heart of Nathan's uncertainty. "I do not know," he admitted. "For 3 years, all I had was rage and purpose. Now that it is gone, I feel unmoored." "Then perhaps you need a new purpose," Grace suggested. "Something to build toward, rather than something to destroy." Before Nathan could respond, a woman appeared in the doorway, middle-aged and stern-looking. "Miss Hammond, I wanted to welcome you to Parowan and introduce myself. I am Mrs. Sarah Watson, head of the Town Council's Education Committee." Grace immediately moved to greet her, all professional courtesy. "Mrs. Watson, how lovely to meet you. This is Mr. Nathan York, who traveled with us on the coach from Salt Lake City." Mrs. Watson's expression suggested she had already heard about the incident at Devil's Pass. "Yes, I heard about the trouble. You are the one who dealt with those outlaws, Mr. York?" "I am," Nathan said simply. "Well, on behalf of the town, I thank you. We have had far too much trouble with that gang." Mrs. Watson turned back to Grace. "I wanted to discuss the curriculum with you, Miss Hammond. Do you have time now?" Grace glanced at Nathan apologetically. "Of course, Mrs. Watson. Mr. York, thank you for stopping by. I will see you this evening?" "This evening," Nathan confirmed, and took his leave. He spent the rest of the day exploring Parowan, getting a feel for the town and its people. The sheriff, a capable-looking man named Harris, approached him around midday. "You are Nathan York." It was not a question. "I am." "I heard what happened at the pass. That was good work, taking down the Cassidy gang." Harris studied Nathan carefully. "What are your plans now?" "Still deciding," Nathan said. "If you are looking for work, I could use a deputy," Harris said. "Someone who knows the country, who can handle himself. Pay is not great, but it is steady." Nathan had not considered law work, but the offer was unexpected and strangely appealing. "I will think on it," he said. "You do that," Harris said. "Come find me when you decide." As evening approached, Nathan returned to the hotel to clean up and change into his new clothes. He still felt strange in them, confined in ways buckskin had not confined him, but when he looked in the mirror, he saw someone who might belong in civilization again, someone who could sit across from Grace Hammond at dinner without frightening her. He arrived at Mrs. Cooper's boarding house exactly on time, his nerves wound tight. Mrs. Cooper herself answered the door, a plump woman with kind eyes. "You must be Mr. York. Miss Hammond is expecting you in the dining room." Grace was waiting at a small table by the window, and Nathan's breath caught at the sight of her. She was wearing a green dress that matched her eyes, and her hair was arranged in soft curls. She looked up as he entered, and her smile was warm and genuine. "You came," she said, as if there had been any doubt. "I said I would," Nathan replied, taking the seat across from her. Dinner was simple but good. Roasted chicken with potatoes and vegetables, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. They talked while they ate, Grace asking questions about Nathan's life before the mountains, and Nathan finding himself answering more honestly than he had expected. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about the farm his family had worked, about how he and his brother had come west after the war seeking opportunity. They had built a small ranch together, raised cattle and horses, made a decent living. "We were happy," Nathan said. "For a few years there, we were genuinely happy." "Tell me about your brother," Grace said gently. Nathan found it harder than expected, but he pushed through. "His name was Nathaniel. He was 2 years younger than me, always cheerful, always seeing the best in people. The ranch was his dream more than mine. He loved the work, loved the land." Nathan's hands tightened on his fork. "When Cassidy's gang came through, they wanted our horses. Nathaniel tried to negotiate, tried to find a peaceful solution. They shot him for it, shot him and left him to die while they took what they wanted." "And they left you for dead too," Grace said quietly. "They shot me 3 times and pushed me into a ravine. They figured the fall would finish what the bullets started, or the wolves would find me." Nathan met her eyes. "I survived out of spite, I think. because I refused to let them win. Grace reached across the table and placed her hand over his. The contact was electric, sending warmth spreading through Nathan's arm. "I am glad you survived," she said. "Not just because you saved us yesterday, but because you deserve to live, Nathan York. You deserve a life beyond revenge." No one had said anything like that to him in years. Nathan found himself turning his hand over, clasping Grace's fingers gently. "What kind of life could a man like me have?" he asked. "I have been a ghost for 3 years. I do not know how to be anything else." "You learn," Grace said. "The same way I'm learning to be independent, to build a life without my father's shadow hanging over me. We both have the chance to become something new, Nathan, to choose who we want to be rather than letting our past define us." They talked long into the evening, the other boarders coming and going around them. Grace told Nathan about her childhood, about her mother's death and her father's decline, about the desperation that had finally driven her west. Nathan found himself sharing things he had never told anyone, about the nightmares, about the loneliness of the mountains, about the fear that he had become something inhuman in his quest for revenge. "You are not inhuman," Grace said firmly. "You are hurt and you are healing. That is different." When Nathan finally rose to leave, the boarding house was quiet and the street outside was dark. Grace walked him to the door, and they stood there for a moment, neither wanting to end the evening. "Thank you for dinner," Nathan said. "For the company." "Thank you for being honest with me," Grace replied, "for letting me see the real you." Nathan wanted to kiss her, wanted it with an intensity that surprised him, but it was too soon, too fast. Instead, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "May I see you again?" "I would like that very much," Grace said, her cheeks flushed. Nathan walked back to the hotel with his heart lighter than it had been in years. Grace had seen him, truly seen him, scars and darkness and all, and she had not turned away. It felt like a miracle, like the first green shoots breaking through snow at the end of winter. The following weeks fell into a rhythm. Nathan took Sheriff Harris up on his offer and became a deputy, using his knowledge of the territory to help track down smaller outlaws and resolve disputes. The work was not particularly exciting, but it gave him structure and purpose. More importantly, it gave him a reason to stay in Parowan. He saw Grace nearly every day. Sometimes he would stop by the schoolhouse during his rounds, watching her teach with patience and enthusiasm. Other times they would have dinner together at the boarding house or take walks through town in the evening. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's minds and hearts with the slow patience of people who knew they had something worth building. Grace's students adored her. Nathan could see it in the way they clustered around her during recess, in how they brightened when she praised their work. She had a gift for making learning feel like an adventure rather than a chore. Nathan found himself volunteering to help with various school projects, using his strength to repair the roof, build new shelves, and construct additional desks as enrollment grew. "You are good with the children," Grace observed one afternoon as Nathan finished installing a new chalkboard. Nathan wiped his hands on a cloth, glancing at the group of students who had been watching him work with fascination. "They are easier to talk to than adults," he admitted. "They do not ask complicated questions." Grace laughed. "They ask nothing but complicated questions. Yesterday, little Emma asked me why the sky is blue and whether angels can fly higher than birds." "What did you tell her?" Nathan asked. "The truth, as best I understand it, that the sky looks blue because of how light scatters through the atmosphere, and that angels, if they exist, probably exist outside the normal rules of physics." Grace smiled. She seemed satisfied with that answer. Nathan found himself smiling back. These moments with Grace, surrounded by the innocent energy of children, felt healing in ways he could not articulate. The rage that had sustained him for 3 years was gradually being replaced by something warmer, something hopeful. One evening in late September, Nathan and Grace took a walk up to the bluffs overlooking Parowan. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. They sat on a flat rock, looking out over the valley with the mountains rising in the distance. "Do you ever miss it?" Grace asked. "The mountains, the solitude?" Nathan considered the question carefully. "Parts of it," he admitted. "I miss the silence, the simplicity. Everything made sense up there. Hunt or starve, find shelter or freeze, survive or die. There were no complicated emotions, no difficult choices. "But you do not want to go back," Grace said, and it was not quite a question. "No," Nathan said. "Because as simple as it was also empty. I existed, but I was not living." He turned to look at her, the setting sun catching in her dark hair and making her eyes glow. "You have taught me the difference, Grace, between existing and living." Grace's breath caught. "Nathan." He reached out and cupped her face in his large, scarred hand. "I'm not good with words. I spent too long alone. But I need you to know that you saved me just as surely as I saved you at that pass. Maybe more." "You are better with words than you think," Grace whispered. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment. "I feel the same way. These weeks with you, they have been the happiest of my life. You make me feel safe and seen and valued in ways I never experienced before." Nathan closed the small distance between them and kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper, as Grace responded with equal passion. Her arms came up around his neck, pulling him closer, and Nathan felt something inside him finally snap into place. This was what he had been missing, what the mountains could never provide. Connection, intimacy, love. They broke apart slowly, both breathing hard. Grace's cheeks were flushed, her lips slightly swollen, and Nathan thought she had never looked more beautiful. "I love you," he said, the words feeling strange and right at the same time. "I know it is too soon. I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but I love you, Grace Hammond." Tears sparkled in Grace's eyes, but she was smiling. "It is not too soon. And I love you too, Nathan York. I think I have loved you since that moment at the pass when you appeared like some avenging angel and saved us all." They held each other as the sun finished setting, the stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Nathan felt peace settle over him, deep and complete. The past 3 years had been about survival and revenge. Now, finally, he could think about the future. Over the following months, Nathan and Grace's relationship deepened. They became a fixture in Parowan, the tall, quiet deputy and the passionate schoolteacher. People smiled when they saw them together, recognizing the kind of love that came along rarely. Nathan proposed on Christmas Eve, going down on one knee in the boarding house parlor with a simple gold band he had commissioned from the town's jeweler. Grace said yes with tears streaming down her face, and Mrs. Cooper immediately began planning the wedding. They were married in early February of 1879 in the small church on Main Street with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Grace wore a cream-colored dress that Mrs. Cooper and several other women had helped her make, and Nathan wore a new suit that felt only slightly less confining than a noose. But when Grace walked down the aisle toward him, her face radiant with joy, Nathan forgot all about his discomfort. Sheriff Harris stood up as Nathan's best man, and Mrs. Cooper served as Grace's matron of honor. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, the preacher speaking about love and commitment and building a life together. When Nathan was finally told he could kiss his bride, he did so with tenderness and passion, earning applause and some good-natured whooping from the crowd. The reception was held at the church hall, with food and dancing in celebration. Nathan was not much for dancing, but Grace pulled him onto the floor anyway, and he found himself swaying with her to the fiddle music, her head resting against his chest. "I never thought I would have this," Grace whispered. "A husband who loves me, a community that values me, a life that is truly my own." "Neither did I," Nathan admitted. "I thought I was done with happiness when my brother died. But you proved me wrong, Grace. You gave me a reason to rejoin the living." They purchased a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy but with good bones and room to grow. Nathan spent his days working as a deputy, gradually earning the respect and trust of the community. Grace continued teaching, her reputation growing as word spread about her innovative methods and genuine care for her students. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. Nathan still had nightmares about his brother's death, nights when he would wake gasping and sweating. But Grace was always there, holding him, talking him down from the panic. She taught him that healing was not linear, that it was acceptable to still hurt even while building something new. Grace had her own struggles, moments when the poverty and fear of her past would creep back in, making her anxious about money or afraid that everything they had built would somehow disappear. Nathan learned to recognize those moments, to reassure her with his steady presence and practical planning. They learned each other's rhythms and patterns, the way all new couples must. Nathan learned that Grace needed quiet time in the mornings to prepare for her teaching day, that she loved reading but often fell asleep with a book on her chest, that she had a surprisingly sharp sense of humor that came out when she felt comfortable. Grace learned that Nathan was most vulnerable at night, that he expressed love through actions more than words, that he had a gentle side that emerged around children and animals despite his intimidating appearance. In the fall of 1879, Grace discovered she was pregnant. Nathan's joy was tempered with fear, remembering how his own mother had died in childbirth, but Grace faced the pregnancy with characteristic determination. "Women have been doing this since the beginning of time," she told him. "We will be fine." The pregnancy was not easy. Grace suffered terrible morning sickness in the early months and swelling in her ankles later on. Nathan hovered anxiously, driving her slightly crazy with his overprotectiveness. He insisted on walking her to school every morning and picking her up every afternoon, despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of walking alone. "Humor me," Nathan would say, and Grace would sigh but take his arm, secretly pleased by his devotion. She continued teaching until her 8th month, finally stepping down when the children's energetic chaos became too exhausting. A temporary teacher was brought in to finish the school year, though Grace fully intended to return once the baby was old enough. Their son was born on a cool spring morning in April 1880, arriving after a long and difficult labor that left Nathan pacing a hole in the floor of the doctor's waiting room. When he was finally allowed into the bedroom, Grace was propped up against pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. "Nathan, meet your son," she said softly. Nathan approached on trembling legs, staring down at the small red face peeking out from the blankets. The baby had a surprising amount of dark hair and was making small mewling sounds. Nathan reached out with one large finger, and the baby's tiny hand immediately wrapped around it with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Nathan breathed, overcome with emotion. "Grace, he is perfect." "What should we name him?" Grace asked. Nathan was silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "Nathaniel, after my brother, if that is acceptable to you." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "It is more than acceptable. Nathaniel York, welcome to the world." Little Nathaniel, who quickly became known as Nate, was a healthy, happy baby who seemed to inherit his father's size and his mother's temperament. Nathan was terrified of the tiny creature at first, afraid his large hands would somehow damage such fragile perfection. But Grace guided him patiently, teaching him how to hold the baby, how to change diapers, how to soothe him when he cried. Nathan discovered that fatherhood suited him. There was something healing about caring for this new life, about being responsible for protecting and nurturing rather than destroying. He would sit for hours holding Nate, watching him sleep, marveling at every tiny expression and movement. Grace returned to teaching that fall, though now she worked only half days, spending the afternoons with Nate. Mrs. Cooper helped with childcare, delighted to have a baby around again. The boarding house women all competed to hold and fuss over Nate, who soaked up the attention with good-natured tolerance. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and milestones. Nate took his first steps on his first birthday, his first words shortly after. He grew into a sturdy, curious toddler who followed his father around whenever possible. Nathan taught him to ride, to fish, to read tracks in the dirt. Grace taught him letters and numbers, reading to him every night before bed. In 1882, their daughter was born, a tiny girl with her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair. They named her Sarah after Nathan's mother. If Nate had been an easy baby, Sarah was his opposite, colicky and demanding and apparently determined to never sleep through the night. But Nathan and Grace navigated the challenges together, supporting each other through the exhaustion and frustration. Sarah proved to be as strong-willed as her mother, with a stubborn streak that appeared early. Where Nate was content to observe and listen, Sarah wanted to be in the middle of everything, demanding attention and interaction. Nathan adored her, his fierce little daughter who feared nothing and challenged everything. By 1884, Nathan had been promoted to chief deputy, Sheriff Harris's right-hand man. He had become a respected figure in Parowan, known for his fairness and his ability to resolve conflicts without violence when possible. The wild man who had come down from the mountains was now a pillar of the community, someone people turned to in times of trouble. Grace had established herself as the best teacher in the region, with families sometimes moving to Parowan, specifically so their children could attend her school. She had expanded the curriculum to include science experiments and geography projects, and had started a lending library for students to take books home. Her passion for education had transformed the town's approach to schooling. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Nathan and Grace left the children with Mrs. Cooper and rode out to the bluffs where Nathan had first told Grace he loved her. They sat watching the sunset, comfortable in the silence that comes from years of shared life. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked finally. "Leaving the mountains, building this life?" Nathan considered the question seriously, as he always did with Grace's inquiries. "No," he said finally. "The mountains gave me time to heal my body and feed my anger. But this life, our life together, it has healed my soul. I would not trade that for anything." "Not even when Sarah keeps you up all night screaming about monsters under her bed?" Grace teased. Nathan smiled. "Not even then, though I admit I look forward to when she sleeps through the night." Grace laughed and leaned against him. "I love you, Nathan York. I loved you when you were a wild mountain man covered in buckskin and blood. I loved you when you were a nervous deputy trying to figure out how to wear a badge. I love you now as a father and husband and community leader. All the versions of you." Nathan turned to kiss her, slow and deep. "And I love you, Grace York. You took a broken man and showed him how to be whole again. You gave me a family, a purpose, a future. You gave me everything." They stayed on the bluff until the stars came out, holding each other and talking about their dreams for the future. Nathan wanted to eventually buy a small ranch, return to the land in a way that honored his brother's memory without being haunted by it. Grace wanted to write a book about teaching methods, to share what she had learned with other educators. They both wanted more children, to fill their house with love and noise and chaos. Those dreams slowly became reality. In 1886, Nathan purchased a plot of land just outside Parowan, and they began building a ranch house. It was nothing like the grand spread some people ran, just a modest operation with some cattle and horses. But it was theirs, built with Nathan's hands and paid for with money they had earned honestly. Their 3rd child, a son they named James, was born in 1887, shortly after they moved into the ranch house. Then came another daughter, Elizabeth, in 1889. The house that had seemed so large was suddenly filled with the sound of children's laughter, running feet, and constant activity. Nathan hired hands to help with the ranch work, choosing carefully to find men who were reliable and kind. He wanted his children to grow up around good examples, to see that strength did not require cruelty, that hard work had value. Grace continued teaching, now traveling into town 3 days a week while the older children helped watch the younger ones. The years brought challenges. There were harsh winters that killed livestock, dry summers that threatened crops, illnesses that swept through the household, leaving everyone exhausted. But there were also triumphs. Nate grew into a strong, thoughtful boy who loved the ranch as much as his uncle had. Sarah became a fierce protector of her younger siblings, bossy and loving in equal measure. James showed early signs of his mother's love for learning, always asking questions and seeking answers. Elizabeth was still too young to show her personality fully, but she seemed to have inherited her father's calm disposition. In 1891, Nathan was offered the position of sheriff when Harris decided to retire. After discussing it with Grace, Nathan accepted, recognizing it as an honor and a responsibility. He took the badge seriously, working to make Parowan and the surrounding territory as safe as possible. His reputation from the Cassidy incident had never quite faded, and potential troublemakers thought twice about causing problems in Sheriff York's jurisdiction. Grace finally published her book about teaching methods in 1893, working with a small press in Salt Lake City. It was not a huge success, but it sold steadily, and she began receiving letters from teachers across the territory thanking her for her insights. She started conducting workshops and training sessions, traveling occasionally to other towns to share her knowledge. Through it all, Nathan and Grace remained each other's anchor. Their love had matured from the passionate intensity of those early days into something deeper and more sustainable. They knew each other's rhythms and moods, could communicate with a glance across a crowded room, could find each other in the dark by instinct alone. On summer evenings, they would sit on the porch of the ranch house, watching their children play in the yard, and marvel at what they had built together. On winter nights, they would huddle close by the fire, reading or talking quietly while the children slept. They stole moments of intimacy whenever they could, keeping the spark alive despite the demands of children and work and life. In 1895, Grace turned 39 and Nathan turned 45. They celebrated with a party at the ranch, friends and neighbors coming from all over the territory. Sheriff Harris was there, now retired and happily spending his days fishing. Mrs. Cooper came, older and grayer, but still running her boarding house. Even Pike made an appearance, telling stories about the infamous Stagecoach rescue that had brought Nathan and Grace together. The children, now ranging from 15-year-old Nate down to 6-year-old Elizabeth, performed a small play they had written about their parents' meeting. It was sweetly inaccurate, portraying Nathan as a heroic knight and Grace as a damsel in distress, nothing like the reality but touching in its childish enthusiasm. Nathan and Grace watched with tears in their eyes, overwhelmed by the love surrounding them. As the party wound down and guests began to leave, Grace and Nathan found themselves alone on the porch once more. The children had been herded off to bed by helpful neighbors, giving them a rare moment of quiet. 17 years, Grace said softly, since that day at Devil's Pass. The best 17 years of my life, Nathan replied, pulling her close against his side. Well, minus the sleepless nights and childhood illnesses, and that time Nate broke his arm falling out of the tree. Grace laughed. It has not been perfect, has it? But it has been real. It has been ours. That is all that matters, Nathan said. He tilted her face up to kiss her, still feeling that spark that had first ignited on a bluff overlooking Parowan. I would do it all again, every moment, if it meant ending up right here with you. Me too, Grace whispered against his lips. Every single moment. The years continued to pass, bringing new challenges and joys. Nate eventually decided he wanted to become a teacher like his mother, much to Grace's delight. Sarah declared her intention to become a doctor, shocking everyone with her ambition. James proved to be a natural rancher, taking to the work like he was born to it. Elizabeth showed early talent for music, and Nathan surprised everyone by learning to play the fiddle so he could accompany her singing. Nathan remained sheriff until 1900, when at age 50, he decided it was time to let a younger man take over. He recommended his deputy, a capable man named Robert Chen, and spent several months training him before officially stepping down. Retirement suited Nathan, giving him more time to focus on the ranch and his family. Grace continued teaching until 1902, when at age 46 she finally admitted that keeping up with energetic children was becoming more difficult. She retired with honors from the school board and began focusing more on her writing, publishing 2 more books about education and beginning work on a memoir about her life in the West. Their children grew and began their own lives. Nate married a lovely young woman named Clara and moved to Salt Lake City to teach at a larger school. Sarah shocked convention by attending medical school in San Francisco, one of the few women in her class. James stayed on the ranch, eventually bringing home a wife and starting the process of expanding the operation. Elizabeth married young to a musician who traveled the Western Territories performing, and they visited the ranch whenever they could. By 1905, Nathan and Grace were in their 50s, grandparents to 3 little ones with more on the way. The ranch house that had once been filled with their children now hosted grandchildren during holidays and summers. Nathan had finally let his hair go fully gray, though he remained strong and vital, still capable of a full day's work. Grace's dark hair now had streaks of silver, but her green eyes remained as bright and intelligent as ever. They still took walks to the bluffs on special occasions, sitting in their favorite spot and watching the sunset over the land they loved. They would hold hands and talk about everything and nothing, comfortable in the life they had built together. Do you remember when you asked me what kind of life a man like you could have? Grace asked one such evening, her head resting on Nathan's shoulder. I remember, Nathan said. I thought I was beyond redemption, beyond happiness. And now? Grace prompted. Nathan looked out over the valley, toward the town where they had made their life, toward the mountains where he had spent those dark years alone. Now I know that redemption is possible, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, that the best revenge against those who hurt us is to build something beautiful out of the ashes. That is rather poetic for an old mountain man, Grace teased gently. Nathan smiled. I learned from the best. You taught me that words matter, that expressing feelings is not weakness. You taught me so many things, Grace. And you taught me that strength can be gentle, that protection does not have to mean control, that love can be both fierce and tender. Grace turned to kiss him softly. We taught each other. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and stars began to emerge. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The sound would have once filled Nathan with loneliness and rage. Now it was just part of the evening symphony, no more threatening than a bird's song. Come on, Grace said finally, standing and offering Nathan her hand. Let us go home. Nathan took her hand and let her pull him to his feet, marveling, as he always did, at how such a small woman could have such strength. They walked back to the ranch house together, their steps matched from years of walking side by side. The house was warm and welcoming when they entered, lamplight spilling out from the windows. James and his wife were visiting for dinner, their children already asleep in the guest rooms. The smell of baking bread filled the air, and Nathan could hear his son and daughter-in-law talking and laughing in the kitchen. This was his life now. Not revenge, not rage, not lonely survival in the mountains, family, love, community, purpose. Grace had given him all of it, had shown him that the life he thought was over had only been waiting to truly begin. As they joined their family in the kitchen, Grace caught Nathan's eye and smiled, the same smile that had first broken through his darkness 17 years ago. Nathan smiled back, his heart full to bursting with gratitude and love. He had come down from the mountains seeking vengeance and had found something infinitely more valuable. He had found his way home, had found the woman who made home worth having. And every day since, he had chosen her, chosen this life, chosen love over hate and building over destroying. It was, Nathan thought, as he pulled Grace close and kissed her temple, the best choice he had ever made, the only choice that had ever really mattered. The evening stretched on with conversation and laughter, with stories shared and plans made. Outside, the Utah night was clear and cold, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The mountains stood eternal in the distance, silent and watching. But Nathan did not look toward the mountains anymore. His eyes were on Grace, always on Grace, the woman who had saved him in every way a person could be saved. And that, Nathan knew with absolute certainty, was exactly where his eyes belonged. Their love story had begun with violence and desperation, with a stagecoach set upon by outlaws and a mountain man seeking revenge. But it had transformed into something beautiful and enduring, proof that even the darkest beginnings could lead to the brightest futures. They had built a life together, filled with love and family and purpose, and they would continue building it together until their final days. That was the real victory, Nathan understood now. Not the revenge he had taken on Cassidy, but the life he had built with Grace. Not the destruction he had wrought, but the creation they had nurtured together. Love had conquered hate, hope had defeated despair, and two broken people had found healing in each other's arms. And they lived happily ever after in their ranch house in Utah Territory, surrounded by children and grandchildren, building something beautiful out of what might have been only ashes. They lived, they loved, and they proved that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to seek it. The mountain man had come down from the hills with vengeance in his heart, but he had stayed in the valley for love, and that made all the difference.